Welcome to the Fuel Pulse Show podcast, where we talk about all things fuel for all kinds of people. I am your host, Eric Bjornstad, and as I say at the start of each episode, I am your guide through the ever-changing world of fuel. So what are we going to talk about on today's episode? Well, we want to talk about the weather. Now, recently we talked about hurricane season, and we talked about how meteorologists are revising their predictions on how much activity we're going to have for the 2023 Atlantic hurricane season and how we might expect to have a busier than normal season. But the thing is that hurricanes don't affect every part of the country. Just like other weather phenomena, like say tornadoes, they don't affect every part of the country. Someone in Colorado probably isn't that worried about hurricanes, as you know, much different than somebody in, let's say, Texas or Alabama. And same for tornadoes. Somebody in Massachusetts, upstate New York, doesn't have to worry about these serious tornadic storms the way that people in Kansas and especially Oklahoma tend to. But there is one thing you can talk about that does affect the great majority of the country during any given year. That is the heat. And right now, virtually everybody agrees that it is hot. Now, because it is so hot, people try to assign blame or causation for why it's so hot. And you'll get other people that will push back and say, well, it's just a cyclical thing that we're going through. People will say, oh, it's hotter than, any time in recorded history or whatever. And then other people will push back. And they'll say, well, how do you know that? How do you know that this isn't just a temporary thing and that we're in some kind of unusually hot period? So one of the things that we wanted to talk about today is, given that it is so hot uh, so far this summer, um, sometimes there's a question that comes out of that, which is that sometimes you'll hear that if you have an unusually hot summer, that means you're also going to have an unusually cold winter that follows that. And so we want to look at that possible relationship. We want to ask, is there an actual relationship between those two things? Is there a correlation between having an unusually hot summer and an unusually cold winter following that? And if there is, what actually causes that relationship? I mean, why does there seem to be a relationship? And does any of this mean anything for us dealing with those of us who deal with fuel right now? As far as since it is so hot right now, that means we got to expect that we're going to have an unusually cold winter, which means we have to do certain things, right, to prepare for that cold weather that's coming up. Does any of this mean anything for those of us who have to worry about that kind of thing? So let's talk about those things. So first of all, right now, this is the month of August. We're heading towards later in the month of August. And when we're talking about the heat right now, it seems like virtually every day you hear about a new record upon record, or near record temperatures that are happening all around the country. I mean, the list of heat records and also heat index records, that feels like temperature, which comes out, or yeah, that feels like mark that comes out of the actual temperature and the humidity combined. Seems like every day it's saying such and such a place set a new record. That list of records is just getting longer and longer and longer. I mean, one single day earlier in the month of August saw more than 200 places in the United States set all-time records for what they call long period high temperatures, which is just basically this term that means the measure of the sustained period of hot weather for an extended period of time, as in days and weeks versus just one measurement on one day. Um, they will often use this thing called a long period hot temperature, and it's kind of like your A1C for if you're a diabetic. An A1C is a reflection of your blood sugar over a long, like 3-month period of time. And a long period high temperature measurement, if you will, is something where it's basically how many days, consecutive days, did the temperature in that region stay consistently above the average for that specific location of time. So it's basically a measurement of, is it hotter than normal? And one day in August, more than 200 places set a record for it being hotter than normal in that respect. Then if you look at more specific things, some specific examples, it's really mind-boggling. Austin, Texas, 44 consecutive days over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. 44 consecutive days, with that streak not expecting to be snapped until sometime in September. Big Bend National Park, also in Texas, reached a ground temperature of 119 degrees. Now, that's not feels like temperature. That's not, in Big Bend today, it felt like 119. No, it was 119 degrees. Think about this, Death Valley, right? We all know that Death Valley holds the all-time record for the hottest temperature on planet Earth. Earlier this summer, I don't know if it was in August or if it was in late July, Death Valley reached 128 degrees, which is 2 degrees short of the all-time record for any place on planet Earth. Look at the list of individual cities that are breaking heat records. It's just too long. It's too long to name all of them. And it's also the kind of thing where if you just decide to list off those cities, then by the time you've heard, the 100th city, it doesn't seem to resonate that much. But take some of these examples. Dallas hit 107 degrees ground temperature. Phoenix, if you're living in Phoenix, you are feeling the heat. Phoenix on August 15th reached 115 degrees actual temperature. And think about this too for Phoenix. At the end of July, Phoenix was working on a streak of 31 consecutive days of 110 degrees or more. The previous record for them was 15, and they had doubled that and were still going at the end of July. So we could go on and just keep naming places like that, but I mean, you just can't deny it. It's really, really, really hot right now. These kind of temperatures where you hear so-and-so hit 100 degrees, so-and-so 99, 102, 103. These temperatures for me kind of reminds me of being a baseball fan, if you will. I grew up watching baseball in the 80s and 90s and 2000s. Back in the 90s, you'd have a closer that comes in, he throws 96, and you say, oh man, that guy throws 96 miles an hour. He's fast. Now, if you watch Major League Baseball, 96 miles an hour is like slow. Somebody has to hit 102 or 103 in order for you to say, oh, that guy's pretty fast. Same thing for these temperatures. When you got Dallas, if somebody said, oh, it was 100 degrees in Dallas, people are like, that's nothing. You got to start hitting, 105, 107, 110 degrees for people to even think it's unusual. But that is the situation that we are in right now. We are in the middle of a really hot summer. In fact, back in early July, you might have heard this, that there was this announcement, and I don't know if the days in question were July the 2nd and 3rd or July the 3rd and 4th. But so we'll say July the 2nd and 3rd. They said that the 2 consecutive days of July the 2nd and July the 3rd were supposedly the 2 hottest days on planet Earth in the last 125,000 years. Okay, that seems like a pretty serious claim. And naturally, that kind of claim was met with a lot of skepticism. I mean, the first thing you think of is, how can they possibly know how hot it was 100,000 years ago? Well, let's zoom out a little bit and consider that. Okay, so it's one thing to talk about what you think the temperature was 100,000 years ago, and we'll talk a little bit about why. They didn't just make that up. There's a reason why they said that July the 2nd and 3rd, 2023 was hotter than any other point in the last 100,000 years. There's a reason they said that. But if you take a step back from that, they weren't around 100,000 years ago with a thermometer taking temperature, right? But they have been taking actual temperatures for the last 175 years or so. Now, that's not 100,000, but it's also not like, what was the temperature, 3 years ago. They do have actual reliable temperature measurement data for the last 175,000 years. And they can say for certain that July 2023 was the hottest month in that global temperature record that they have. So it's at least the hottest month in the last almost 2 centuries. But we know 175 years is different from claiming that it's the hottest in the last 125,000 years. But as I said, they didn't just make that figure up. There's a reason why they are saying that. So scientists have various methods that they can use to estimate temperatures from thousands of years ago. And it's a field of study known as paleoclimatology. And so they use these temperatures to try and help us understand how the Earth's climate may or may not be changing over long periods of time. And so some of the techniques that these scientists will use, first of all, they'll look at ice cores. So ice cores, you go up to the Arctic and the Antarctic. Ice cores are samples that are taken from ice sheets and glaciers, which happen to be really, really old, right? And these layers of ice that they take these samples of have tiny air bubbles that are trapped. And those happen to be air bubbles from the atmosphere from the time that the ice formed, which means they're actual air from the Earth's atmosphere from 10,000 or 50,000 years ago. And so they will look at these air bubbles in these ice core samples, and they'll analyze their composition. They'll look at the isotopes of the oxygen and the hydrogen in the air bubbles and in the ice. And from that, they can infer what the temperature was like, thousands and tens of thousands of years ago. Another thing they will look at is tree rings. See, trees, of course, grow, and they grow with these rings that go out and out and out in their trunks. And trees grow one ring per year, and the thickness of the rings tell us about the condition that the tree experienced while it was growing, including the temperature. If you have a wider ring, that indicates a warmer, more favorable temperature for growth. If you have a narrower ring, that infers a cooler, harsher condition. Tree didn't grow as much. And so they'll look at tree rings from really old trees. They will also look at sediment cores. Similar to the ice cores, they will look at sediment cores from lakes and oceans, which accumulate sediment over long periods of time. And many times this sediment will contain remains of tiny organisms and other materials. And so they will analyze the types of organisms in that sediment. They'll also analyze the chemical composition of the sediments. And from that information, scientists can deduce past climate conditions. So those are some of the things they'll also look at. They'll look at coral reefs. They'll do isotope analysis of various materials. And from all those things together, they can get a picture of what the climate was like from a long, long time ago. So this isn't a situation where scientists are just making things up, pulling things out of the air to say, hey, it's hotter now than it was 150,000 years ago. They have a reason for making that kind of claim. Okay, so we've established that it's really hot. We may even have established that it's historically hot. So let's go to the question at hand, which is the relationship between hot summers and cold winters. Now, first thing we'll say from the onset is there can be a relationship between having a really hot summer and a really cold winter, but after we've said that, we have to be really careful to note that yes, there can be a relationship, but it's not necessarily a direct cause and effect relationship between those things. There are always multiple things working together, playing at that relationship. So any kind of cause and effect relationship between a hot summer and a cold winter necessarily involves or has to take into account larger atmospheric, larger oceanic patterns that are present, which can influence the weather conditions that you're going to see. In other words, there's some complexities to this whole thing. Now, when we say yes, there is a relationship. The reason we say that is because there are two phenomenon that meteorologists know about that are commonly associated with this idea of having a really cold winter following a really hot summer. Those two phenomenon are what they call the Arctic Oscillation phenomenon and the North Atlantic Oscillation phenomenon. So, if you listen to the past episode that we did on hurricanes, we referred to another kind of oscillation, a multi-decadal oscillation, which basically was a weather pattern that talked about sea temperatures getting hot and cold over multiple years at a time. So it's somewhat similar to that, but not exactly. So let's explain what these things are. First of all, this Arctic Oscillation thing. The Arctic Oscillation, well, do I want to say thing, pattern? The Arctic Oscillation is a climate pattern, okay? And it is characterized by fluctuations, not in sea temperatures like that other thing was, fluctuations in atmospheric pressure over the Arctic and adjacent areas. That basically means areas up north towards the top of the Earth. They will undergo fluctuations in their atmospheric pressure. Sometimes it will be high, sometimes it'll be low. So when this Arctic oscillation is in what they call a positive phase, okay, that means that the atmospheric pressure up in the Arctic is relatively high over that polar region. If you have high pressure up in the polar regions, what happens? How does that affect us? Well, what that does is it basically results in the really cold air that's up there. It actually gets confined and trapped up there. It doesn't tend to travel south as early or as much. And so if you don't have all this really cold, frigid Arctic air coming down, as you might infer, as you might expect, this means you'll get a milder winter conditions in the regions further down south, like where we are in the United States. Okay, that's what happens if this Arctic oscillation is in a positive phase with high pressure up there. Now, we said it was fluctuations, so that means you can get periods where it's not in a positive phase, it's in a negative phase. Negative phase means you don't have high pressure keeping that air up there, you have low pressure. And as you can expect, if the high pressure keeps it trapped up there, when this switches to low pressure, that cold, frigid air is going to come down southwards and it's going to hit us. And that means we're going to get colder winter conditions in the United States. So that's this Arctic oscillation thing. And the other thing that they talked about was the North Atlantic oscillation. Similar type thing. It's a related climate pattern, and it involves those same kinds of fluctuations in pressure differences, but this time not necessarily in the Arctic, but this time in the North Atlantic, specifically where Iceland and what they call the Azores, if you know where those are. Just think Iceland. Just think the areas near like Great Britain, that area of the North Atlantic. The pressure will fluctuate. It'll go high and then it'll go low. So when you have a positive North Atlantic oscillation phase, then you have higher pressure up there. And what that results in is you get milder winter temperatures in Europe and in parts of the North Atlantic. When it goes negative, you get colder winter conditions in Europe and the North Atlantic. So the connection between a hot summer and a cold winter will often be related to shifts in these oscillation patterns, right? If you have a particularly hot summer like what we're having right now, this will influence the ocean conditions and the atmosphere conditions that tend to contribute to these patterns and influence whether they switch from positive to negative or vice versa. So, for instance, if you have a hot summer, you get warmer ocean surface conditions, especially in the North Atlantic. When the water's warmer, this influences the NAO and tends to favor a positive phase, making a milder winter. Okay, so we just said hot summer, milder winter in certain regions. Okay, um, that being that being said, there's also, you look at things like sea ice. If you have a change in the amount of sea ice, for example, and the amount of atmospheric circulation during a hot summer, that will also have downstream effects on not the North Atlantic oscillation, but the Arctic oscillation. And what that can actually do is that can actually make the Arctic oscillation turn negative, which means then colder winter coming down. Okay, so you've got these two weather patterns, and you've got this, these things happening, which might lead, someone might argue, well, that means that's telling us that we're going to have a milder winter, not a colder one. And then someone else might say, yeah, but look at this other pattern. That actually means we're going to have a colder winter. Okay, so you seem to have two competing things. And frankly, it can be a little bit confusing. Well, let's throw another wrinkle into this. Remember, we talked about in other podcasts, we talked about this El Nino weather pattern. The El Nino weather pattern in the Pacific was something that is characterized by warm sea temperatures in the Pacific Ocean, which then affect the weather in the Atlantic. So what they're saying is likely to be happening here is when you have a hot summer. You have a hot summer, that may possibly lead to colder Arctic air coming down. Then at the same time, what an El Nino system actually does is it doesn't necessarily influence the temperature that we're going to see. It influences the amount of moisture that we see. If you have an El Nino system, many times that results in greater amounts of moisture over the coming winter season. So think about it. If it's very possible that we're going to have colder Arctic air coming down and making things really cold in the United States because of this Arctic oscillation pattern. If you have that possibility on one hand, then on the other hand, you have this El Nino system making it more likely that we're going to get more moisture in the air. What does that tell you that we might see? That means that it is very possible that we're going to be seeing some of the same harsh blizzard winter storms conditions that we have seen in the past few years. Those conditions that cause a lot of real problems for people all across the country. That means that because of the fact that we're having a really hot summer, that could mean that we are going to be in for another rough, really cold, wet, snowy, blizzardy winter. So you're welcome for that good news. Okay, so the bottom line for the question of does a hot summer mean a cold winter? The answer to that is not always, but yeah, it's very, very possible that the chances are greater that we're going to have a cold, blizzardy, hard winter this year coming. That means 2024 winter, because the 2023 summer has been so hot. Okay, so we've given you the good news there. Now, we always try to say, what does any of that mean as far as, is there anything that we should be doing in response to knowing that, in response to having that kind of knowledge? So if you have fuel that you're going to need to use this winter, if you have stored fuel that you're going to need to use this winter, what we were just talking about could be your wake-up call to make sure that you've taken the steps that you need to take on, shall we say, the anti-gel side, the winter treatment side. What you should be taking away from what we're talking about here is that there's a good chance, a very good chance, that this winter is going to be bad. But you have a chance right now to stay ahead of any problems that might come along with that. That means you really got to be prepared to treat your fuel for what we say cold weather handling. Now, treating treating for cold weather has similar rules, if you will, to treating for stabilization, in that you have to get fuel treatment into the fuel before the problem arises. For fuel being treated for stabilization, that means you add stabilizer to the fuel when the fuel is fresh before it has undergone these chemical reactions. For cold weather handling, you put anti-gel into the fuel before it gels. Okay. The question is, if you think that you will need to treat your stored fuel sometime this winter, how do you know when you need to do that? The answer depends on where you're at, because it depends on what the temperatures are going to be where you're at. And to really get an idea of when you're going to need to do this, you need to take several things into account. First thing is, what's the cloud point of the fuel that you're at? Now, diesel fuel has certain kinds of temperatures, what we would say cold weather temperatures, associated with it. Cloud point, cold filter plug point, and pour point. Now, not all fuel suppliers list all of these. If they're likely to list any of them, it's going to be the cloud point. And they should at least be able to tell you what the cloud point of your diesel fuel is. Now, if you know your stored fuel's cloud point, then you can use a pretty safe assumption that its gelling point, we might say cold filter plug point, but we'll just call it its gelling temperature, its gelling point. That's likely going to be, between 5 and 10 degrees below the cloud point temperature. Some of that depends on the fuel's exact composition, but usually it's safe to use this rule of thumb. Now, one of the interesting things about cloud point, right, is the cloud point of the diesel fuel that you have can vary depending on where in the country you're at, and it can vary what time of year. In other words, it can vary pretty widely if the fuel is winter diesel or if it is summer diesel. And that is because refineries have the ability to blend diesel fuels, to compose them, to mix them together and create diesel fuels that have higher cloud points or lower cloud points depending on where that fuel is going and what time of year it is. Because the refineries want to create a product that actually does have a chance of not having problems. And so they will actually adjust the fuel's composition relative to what they think is going to happen relative to temperature. And what they try to do is they try to take into account what they call the 10th percentile temperature of a given region. 10th percentile temperature is the temperature during a given month or during a given 30-day period where it's a temperature that you would not expect it to get colder than that more than 2 or 3 times in that period. That is the 10th percentile temperature. And every place across the country has data that, historical temperature data that gives the refinery an idea of what that temperature is. And so they will often try to use that as kind of a guide to what the cloud point of the fuel that they're producing should be. They usually try to get the cloud point of the fuel sometime around that mark or maybe a little bit higher. And so that is why your fuel's cloud point, wherever you're at, there could be a difference in it depending on where you're at and also what time of year it is. Because there's going to be a big difference in the expected low temperature if you're in Chicago in June, right, versus if you're in Denver in February. So if the refinery is already doing this is a question that comes out of this. If the refinery is already doing this, making fuel that takes these expected low temperatures into account, does that mean that you don't need to worry about gelling because the refinery's already blending diesel fuel that's only going to cloud if it reaches this really low temperature? Well, unfortunately, as with many other things in life, it's not as simple as that. So for one thing, because the actual gelling points, cloud points and gelling points of diesel fuel are situation and equipment dependent. Okay, that's the first thing you have to take into account. Gelling point is always X degrees below the cloud point. We said that a good rule of thumb is 5 to 10 degrees. But really, the gelling point is determined as much by the equipment that you're using as it is by the composition of the fuel. And that is because gelling is really a function of what happens in the engine. Gelling refers to if enough paraffin, gelled paraffin, gets caught in the fuel filter and ends up plugging it and shutting down engine operation. That's the actual gelling point of the fuel. And that can differ depending on what kind of diesel system you have. Now, most of the new engine, well, I don't say most, virtually all of the newer diesel systems are common rail diesel engines, and they have fuel filters that have much, much less leeway in this than the fuel filters of the past. And what that has done is that has brought the effective gelling point closer to the cloud point than it ever used to be. Now you're getting effective gelling points within 5 degrees of the cloud point simply because of that difference in fuel filtration. Refineries cannot take all those possible differences into account, but you can if you know what you're looking for. So, our recommendation for this coming winter, if it's going to be a colder, harder winter, then you need to look at the cloud point of the fuel that you've got. And what we would say is you should plan to put some kind of anti-gel in it when the expected temperatures in your region over the next 30 days are predicted to drop to within 10 degrees of your fuel's cloud point. Okay, now that's good if you know what your cloud point is. But what if you don't have any idea what the cloud point is? Well, now you have to play an educated guessing game, right? Now, we already know that cloud points for diesel fuel vary by refinery and geographic location, right? We also know they differ between the winter and the summer diesel fuels that you get, and they can differ substantially between those. I mean, for example, winter diesel fuel sold in Texas can have a cloud point of minus 10 Fahrenheit. But in that same area of the country in Texas, the summer diesel that you're going to get can have a cloud point that's 40 degrees higher than this. So it would make a big difference what kind of diesel fuel you happen to have in your storage tank. Now, many times we end up with mixtures of winter and summer, depending on how quickly you use that fuel up. So if you have good reason to believe that you've got a mix of summer and winter that is kind of summer and winter diesel that's kind of developed in your tank, then your cloud point's going to be, by definition, higher than would be if you had 100% winter diesel in there. And you're going to need to take that into account. You're going to want to err on the side of caution when it comes to making your treatment decisions. So let's take that Texas example. If you were in Texas and you knew that you had 100% winter diesel fuel in there, and you knew that the cloud point was minus 10 Fahrenheit, okay, then you would be monitoring the projected temperatures, for the coming, January and February. And when you start to see some of the projected lows that are approaching 0 degrees Fahrenheit, again, remember, not centigrade, which is 32, but 0 degrees Fahrenheit, which is more like minus 20. You see some of those, you see that in the next month, it's projected to get down to 0 or below, 4 or 5 times. Now you're going to say, okay, I need to have the anti-gel in my fuel before that happens. And so you would make plans for that. But what if you're in Texas, but you don't know that you got 100% winter diesel? You have good reason to believe that you actually have some summer diesel fuel in there. Well, now your cloud point of that's actually going to be some substantial amount of degrees higher than that. You won't know exactly what it is unless you got it tested, but short of doing that, you have to make that assumption that it's going to be some amount of degrees higher. Now, it's not going to be 40 degrees higher because it's not 100% summer, but you're also not likely to see a cloud point of minus 10. So what temperature exactly should you plan for? Well, unfortunately, we can't really tell you exactly, but we can just advise that it's always better to be cautious than to miss the mark, so to speak, and then have an unexpected gelling situation happen at what always seems to be the worst critical time when these kinds of things happen. So that is what we have to talk about today. Hot summer, what we're going through right now, means there's a very good chance we're going to have a really cold winter. And that means you have a chance to head off those problems if you are proactive about these things. So that is all for today's episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast. As always, you can find information on everything that we talked about in the show notes. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the Fuel Pulse Show podcast at your famous or favorite platform that you get your podcasts at. Leave us a rating. Good ratings are very important to helping people find us and getting the word out. So again, thank you for joining us for this episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast. I am, as always, your host, Eric Bjornstad, your guide through the ever-changing world of fuel. I will see you next time on the next episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast.